Hello, everyone, and welcome to our virtual studio visit with artist Joe Bertini. Joe, it's wonderful to have you with us today, joining us from New Mexico. Thank you so much. I'm Daisy McGowan. I'm the director of GOCA. I should introduce myself to everybody out there. And we've started these studio visits, back in March, kind of right away when things shut down for the galleries. As a contemporary art curator, a big part of my practice is the studio visit. And last year in 2019, I believe I did almost 200 studio visits all over the country. And yeah, the pace can be really intense. And also, I just love it. I love that point of connection with artists and learning about their work. And it's a very special space. And it's often a sort of an intimate experience, so I really appreciate you being open to sharing your space with us, your work in progress, sharing a bit about your process, and talking with us today about where you are and what you're working on in the studio. And I'm excited to share that we are working together on an exhibition coming up at GOCA's and Center for the Arts Marie Walsh Sharpe Gallery Contemporary Art. And right now we're looking at summer 2022. It's so hard to tell what's going to happen next week right now, so that seems very distant. But I think I really was excited to get a chance to do a studio visit with you as well, to look at the work, and I can't wait till we can see it in person, which I hope to do as well before that show, once we can travel. So yeah, I just want to start like I do with all of these. First, I'll say thank you to our sponsors. And for all of these, we bring some funding to our artists because we believe so passionately that the work of artists deserves compensation always. And so that's part of this series as well. It's modest, of course, but it's part of showing respect to artists. And we believe that strongly at GOCA. So I'll start off by saying, if you could share a little bit about yourself, your background, and then tell us a little bit about where you are physically in space right now.
Okay, so my name's Joe Bertini, and I'm an Australian artist, as you can probably hear from my wide accent. I'm from Sydney, but I have a rural property out in it's called the Central West of New South Wales, which is a state. And I have a very large wool shed, as I was explaining to Daisy before, that is about the size of a museum gallery space where I usually paint. And it's a great privilege to paint there. It's filthy and it stinks of sheep and lanolin, but it's perfect for an artist because it's just got massive floor-to-ceiling height and wall space and perfect light. But now, at the moment, I'm here in New Mexico, and I'm very lucky. I've been awarded it's called an O1 visa, an extraordinary talent visa, and I was sponsored by an organization actually in Colorado Springs, where you are, Smoke Brush Foundation. But originally I was brought here by a patron of the arts, a private patron who knows my work from Australia, who collects a lot of Indigenous artists' work. And she and her husband are American art philanthropists and patrons, and they've built a sort of museum collection. And she invited me to come to Santa Fe and New Mexico in 2015 and do a residency with them. And that's when I first came here and just fell in love with the landscape here and the desert here. And then since then, she's been very supportive. And then I met people and worked, out at Ghost Ranch with George O'Keeffe Foundation, people like that. And I'm known in Australia as a predominantly desert painter. I've spent many decades out in the central deserts of Australia working in Indigenous communities. And I also spent 10 years as an expedition artist with scientific research expeditions into very remote, inaccessible regions of deserts in Australia that have never been researched or explored before. And we'd take a team of scientists from the national institutions, universities and museums, and we would travel often with Indigenous people, but sometimes, depending on the country we were going to, And we'd travel with a string of pack camels, about 25 pack camels, and all our gear, because the only way to get there is to walk. So it would literally take months, and sometimes about 6 months of the year. So traveling and exploring and researching paleontology, archaeology, botany, ornithology, plants, animals, geography, archaeology, like I said. So, and I was the expedition artist, so I would have to document the whole thing, and any scientific work that needed documenting. In terms of illustration, often areas are very sensitive and they're not allowed to be photographed, or events happen or scientists have to record things that are visible to them but not really visible to the human eye. So things like parts of bone that are underground that they haven't been given permission to excavate or remove, and so they ask me to draw it in the shape that they know it exists in, but I have to draw the seen and the unseen. So that kind of thing. And then I also got to document all the expeditions for 10 years artistically for myself, and have, museum and gallery shows from that work. And then I came here, and then I was invited to spend time in India doing the same kind of research work with tribal people in the northwest of India, in Kutch, who are very endangered, for the Indian and Australian governments, mostly the Indian government, who did a big museum exhibit in New Delhi that I was a part of. And actually the beauty of all of the work that I've done over the last few decades is the fact that I'm a woman, because in Australia there's never historically been a female expedition artist. So I'm the only time the desert has been seen artistically through female eyes. So I think that's quite valuable to the historic archive, that it's not always a male perspective, that, we're starting to get female perspectives on things that haven't been historically archived. So, and the same in India. The reason I was invited was because I was a woman, and a lot of these tribal communities would not allow the females in their community, the women and girls, to be viewed by a male artist. So they wanted a female artist. So that's what I do. I offer a female perspective on desert regions of the world. And now I'm here in beautiful Abiquiu, and I have this amazing little studio, very little, but it's adobe, which is the traditional mud-walled, low wooden ceilinged, thick mud-walled studio. And it's on a little hillock in the Chama River Valley, and to the west I see all the way up the valley to the Pedernal, which is a very famous sacred mountain to the Native American people, where they collect their chert stone for making stone tools. And then down to the east, I see all the way down the river valley to the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which are also geologically very famous for the rivers, the Colorado River, and the link with the Grand Canyon and that mountain range that runs through the, I suppose, northwest of America. The Grand, what are they called? The Rocky Mountain chains, yeah. And also very sacred mountains to the indigenous people, and also to the colonial, the conquistadors, the Spanish, the New Mexicans, the Anasazi, all peoples. So I'm sort of, can you hear me? Because now I can't hear you.
You're great. I'm just listening and taking it all in. Your story is so fantastic, and I read it and I've talked to you about it, but I still just get enthralled, following your life story. As an artist, you've really broken so many barriers, but also just had these amazing experiences that really come through. And I was thinking while you were talking about New Mexico, because of course we're up in Colorado, and Colorado and New Mexico seem like they'd be fairly similar, but they're so different in many ways. New Mexico has this, some of the oldest, it does have the oldest continually inhabited settlement in North America, right? You have this layering of indigenous history And then, of course, then you have the Spaniards, you know, the colonizers who came in, and then you have the Western expansion of, you know, other layers. And New Mexico is particularly, you know, rich with history as compared to other parts of the West, which maybe have less layers, I guess I'll say. There's always history everywhere. And I love that, you know, there's land acknowledgements now, that people build that in and acknowledge the peoples that were there before. And I think in where we are in Colorado, it's many people that were nomadic because, you know, the desert doesn't support, or these high desert mountain arid landscapes can't support a continuous settlement typically. But the nomadic lifestyle is necessary to move around, obviously, for food and water. And now we're settling it in these very different sort of unsustainable ways. And anyways, I was just struck thinking about how many different layered and historic experiences you've taken in, and with your work. I also love that balance between, you know, being someone who documents and on that very scientific side, and working with the expeditions, of being sensitive to the ways to document, and then also bringing your artwork in, which of course has a heavy landscape component, but often I think, you know, I've seen quite a few of your works that go in towards abstraction and more towards an emotional experience, which when you talk about, you know, your experiences, I hear that a lot too. Anyways, so I could hear you just fine. I was just being reverent and sort of just really enjoying hearing your story. It's really, we're just really fortunate to have you on our studio visit series, and then also to, I'm very excited to get to work with you on this project and exhibition coming up. So,
and I was thinking about what you said about New Mexico, and I think I've always had this, because I traveled many lifetimes ago. I did a book, and I painted and wrote a book about the Silk Route, and I traveled the Silk Route and spent time in Pakistan, Afghanistan, all those sort of desert areas as well. And Santa Fe and New Mexico, the Santa Fe Trail to me is the North American Silk Route, because it was the trading route, you know, from east to west, and Europeans came here to trade. So Santa Fe has that same kind of, I mean, a lot of people know the Silk Route through Marco Polo's writings and the links between, you know, the East and the West civilizations. But the Santa Fe Trail for me, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and this whole area still has such a rich sense of that, of being still a trading route for people, and still having that sense, the same sense that you get in northern India, of it being a migrational seasonal route for people. And it's still happening. It's just kind of a human instinct, I think, that draws certain people to areas to travel. And this is definitely one of those sort of magnetic courses that humans are drawn to instinctively.
yeah, and I've seen a lot of honesty as well with that history and problematic elements of it, you know, looking at it through the contemporary lens, and really addressing it. In New Mexico, I think, it, you know, because the Pueblos were, you know, stayed there, and the indigenous people stayed on their land, you know, obviously were not treated great. That's an understatement, but by and large, we're not moved off the land like they were in other places in the US. That there's been a reconciling of, and just, you know, speaking the truth of some of these things, and a lot of these things that happened were not okay, but that's also the history, and let's take it on and let's talk about it. And
those living pueblos are all around me. Like, you drive through, I have to drive through them every day pretty much. And the fact that, you know, New Mexico has the highest number of still not only historic and archaeological pueblo sites, and there's our property is actually on one, and there's across the river, like, we pick up pottery shards everywhere, but there are also living pueblos here. And a Navajo friend of mine, she's taken me out onto her country, and you know, they're still accessing, and they still have the same connectedness to country that in a lot of parts of the world, the Indigenous people have been moved off country and so have lost that connection to country, which they talk about all the time as a type of yearning, as a type of need. And a lot of the Indigenous people here, fortunately, have retained that integrity of connection to country, and they're very fierce about it. Like my Navajo friend, they're strong people. They're very fierce about protecting their connection to country because they need it. They need it to sustain them, not just art practices and their culture, but you know, they're living. It's a living history.
Yeah, that's a great way to see it. And I do think in places like Colorado, we've got a real issue with sort of this like mythical story of cowboys and Indians per se, that is so fake and really doesn't honor anybody. And I think one thing I see with New Mexico is really a lot of leadership in the area of taking on those difficult conversations, and I think a lot of that is that long and deep connection to the land, and standing your ground, literally. And so you're in a pretty amazing place there. But all the other sites that you've traveled in your history is just remarkable. I wonder if you could share with us a little bit about what you're working on right now, and also, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your particular story of what it's meant to be working in the US these last, 8 months, or you've been here longer than that, since your last travels back to Australia.
Yeah, I think we got here, I got back here like 2 days before they shut down again, shut the airports, and COVID was declared a kind of global pandemic. So who knew? But yeah, so I've been here since early mid-March.
Yeah, so about 8 months.
Yeah. So what would you like me to talk about first? So do you want me to talk about my practice? Would you like me to talk about what I'm working on?
Yeah, let's dive into what you're working on right now, and I can share some images you shared with me, if you want me to pull those up, and we can talk a little bit, or if you want to sort of talk about it and then I can pull those up, however you want to do it.
Okay, well, I've sort of crammed, it's like I said, a small Adobe studio, so I sort of shoved a whole lot of work, some work still wet that are hanging, the bigger ones sort of on either side of me, and they're literally floor to ceiling because that's the height I can get in here. And I know when they go into museums and galleries, they sort of diminish, like I said, but you know, they're about 2 by 2 meters, which I'm not sure what that is in inches or feet.
6 by 6 feet.
Thank you. Thank you. So, and then I have, you know, a range that, so what I normally spend a lot of time working out on plein air, and I do a lot of these kind of little studies, just works on paper, and I can't, like I said, I can't move the computer around because I'll probably lose my connection, but I just have like a sketchbook, can you see, and I do a lot of these just little quick gouache studies. I just fill sketchbooks with these little quick studies, and they're just thinking ideas. So I paint from the landscape originally, and like my training has been very technical, and you know, that's technical drafting and technical drawing, and you know, very highly formalized, and that's why I'm able to do that kind of thing if it's needed. But when I want to work for myself, I'm not working ever from a translation of place and trying to represent place. I'm working from ideas. So it's a view that will catch my artistic attention, and I'll see a window into something, and it's informed by the knowledge that I've collected. So not just knowledge over the decades of other deserts and historical sites, but I might catch a glimpse of something that will remind me of a petroglyph that I saw on a cave in Arnhem Land in Northern Australia. And then all of a sudden I see a funny little petroglyph carved, you know, maybe concentric circles or water dreaming here, or I see a little antelope or a little animal. So I work in the landscape, and then I bring it back into the studio, and I have piles of these notebooks and sketch papers, and I start to process, and I sort of leave it all out around me so that it filters through my consciousness. And I'm always thinking about what it is that is my experience of this, because it's no point me trying to do some kind of, you know, scientific record, because that's not what I'm here for artistically. So it's more, I'm trying to make an evocation rather than a translation of the place. And it's more about the poetry and the artistry that I can find in the landscape and in the knowledge I have of the botany, the indigenous people, the history we've just been talking about. There's no point me just documenting that. That's not my place in this period in art history. So my place is to find my perspective, and that's a particularly female perspective, obviously, because I'm a woman, and of my own experience. So then I start working on these paintings, and I usually, I like to work on unstretched canvas, because I just find it allows me to be very free. So I can just I just usually throw a lot of oil paint around, and I'm working from impressions of all the stuff that's filtering through me. And I put down a lot of color grounds. And then if I unroll this big piece of canvas and just throw paint around on it and start to make impressions, I start to visualize, I start to see things. So it's like dreams start to appear. It's an enigma, but the enigma starts to reveal itself through the process. And then because it's unstretched, I can cut the canvas, I can do what I want with it. And I can play around with format and scale. Sometimes I work, like behind me I have an easel, and sometimes if the studio gets too crowded I'll work on stretched canvas. Sometimes I work on board. I work on any medium. I've been known to work on glass and perspex and bits of cardboard, anything, until I find that the image starts to reveal itself. And often I'll start with an intention, and then the intention gets corrupted by the process. So
yeah, I wanted to talk to you, thinking about some artists, when you say the word practice, they say, what do you mean practice? Like as if you have to keep practicing. But I think of a practice as sort of a regular process. And I have a background with art as well, and I know a lot of times the physicality of moving through, you know, a process that you've developed can open up those channels in your mind to really kind of let go of the critic maybe, or the controlling. And you've got, you know, so much experience that probably it's hard to even articulate it. But as you were describing your process, I was thinking, I was wondering to ask, do you have a regular practice of going out in the landscape? Is there a time of day you regularly sort of go out, or is it just sort of if you're at a point where you're wanting to do your sketches more and between the larger paintings? And then also when you move into the studio, it sounds to me like you said it's evocation, not translation. So you're not necessarily taking your study and replicating it. Those are really just almost like when you think about how you generate material in waking life for your dreams, you know, by your taking everything, it sounds a little bit more like that, where you're really you're training your eye and sort of capturing the colors and the feelings more in a way, and the composition.
yeah, it's note taking. So the field work, working out on plein air, is really about making my brain function in a certain way. It's not about what I produce. So the work that I produce, the sketches, the drawings, I look at them, but often I might not look at them for months. So, but they're there because every now and then I'll need to reconnect, and so I can flick through them. And once you've practiced, and I actually say this to my students a lot, there's no point taking a photograph. because there's no experience there. So the minute you've had an experience, when you've made a point of seeing and recording, observing and recording, and that hand-eye coordination, it connects some synapses in your brain. And once you've made those synaptic connections, there's a memory of that experience. So I only need to glance at my sketchbooks, and I remember exactly what I was looking at. But more importantly, I remember what I was thinking. I remember the idea that caught my attention, that I was looking maybe at a sunset and the incredible glow of the cliffs and the colors. And I thought, that looks like, or that reminds me of, or, oh, I know what that means in terms of geological strata and, you know, the timelessness of the land, or something like that. So it connects me to the idea. And that's the value in it. So the value is not in the product, in the sketch or the drawing. The value is actually in the idea. And it's that idea that I'm trying to get a tail of. So like you said, you know, it's the process is so multifarious that you sort of, you may start with an intention. You may start thinking, I'm in control, I know what I'm doing. And it will corrupt you every time, because it's the serendipity of painting. You know, you think you're painting a beautiful yellow landscape and your brush passes through red paint on your palette, and all of a sudden you put a great big red swipe in it and you think, oh, what have I done? And then you look at it and think, oh my God, I know what I want to do now. And you just discard all your old ideas and you let go and you go with the process. But you have to keep, I have to keep reconnecting to the fundamental sense of place, because it's very easy also to go down the rabbit hole of following process and allowing, you know, the beauty of painting is just the joy of working with color and with the medium and the brushes, and you can get very seduced by process, and you know, we all do, but you have to, it's such a balancing act, retaining your sense of control over your thinking and your intention and your knowledge and your experience, and then having the freedom in process to make everything look kind of effortless and serendipitous and uncontrolled and instinctive. And that's what it needs to be. You need to sort of come to something through process that's instinctive, that as soon as you catch the thread of something and you start to pull it and it unravels, and all of a sudden it reveals itself to you and you stand back and you say, take your hand off, that's it. I didn't know that's where I was going, but I recognize it, because it has an authenticity and an integrity about it, which is what I was trying to say. And I didn't really know how to communicate that except when I recognize it through paint.
Yeah, in the way you describe that, you know, your process with observing the landscape, you know, of course, the difference between taking a photograph, like you articulated, you're not spending the time of really looking, right? When you take the photo, you sort of almost don't look, because you think, oh, this machine's going to record it for me. I don't have to make that time to look. But when you take that time to look, you sort of allow it to unfold in front of you, and might notice things that if you didn't take that time, you know. But then when you're painting, it sounds to me like your process is with painting is sort of similar. You're working, you have a starting point, but then you're also sort of observing your painting as it develops, and then standing back and saying, oh, I didn't see that before, and sort of you know, and it develops into full view in front of you. Obviously you're in control of it, but in some ways you're allowing that observation, which seems so threaded throughout all of your practice and your work as an artist, is so central.
Yeah, it's seeing, it's observation. You're absolutely right. This is why we need to work with people who can articulate, because my medium of communication is obviously not verbal, and it's very hard to articulate. And so it's very important for artists to work and collaborate. I believe, you know, with writers and with people in other artistic fields like yourself and other who are knowledgeable and have a way of seeing how I see, if that makes sense. You know, you can articulate objectively how I see, because I'm so subjectively involved in it that sometimes it's hard for me to articulate. But like we were saying about the photograph and the camera, and it's a really important distinction between, people often say, you know, why would you take an expedition artist out to India or to Australia or to America, to these places, these sacred places? Just take a photograph, take a video. You know, this is technology. And aside from the fact that often they're very sacred and you need a special charter from the Indigenous people or the government or whatever to do it, it's also a photograph, and the lens of a camera and a video camera doesn't see selectively. It sees how you control it to see, and it will take a picture of everything that you pointed at. Whereas an artist's eye sees selectively. So I see through the filter of my own prejudice. I see through the filter of my own upbringing and education and knowledge and experience. And so I might look at a scene, often, you know, I'll be sitting on a sand dune painting, and a scientist will come and sit next to me and ask if they can watch. And they often sort of look to where I'm looking and look at what I'm doing and look out and say, where is that? You know, because they don't see it. And I'm like, it's right there. And they're like, but I can't see what you're seeing. And I'm like, really? And that's why they take, you know, that's why when we go on expeditions, we'll take an ornithologist or a botanist or an architect. We take a group of people who are trained to see selectively in certain areas. So the ornithologist will say in the evening, oh my God, did you see all those red-tailed hawks? And the botanist will say, no, but did you see all the chamisa that was flowering? You know, and it's like, oh, what's chamisa? You know, and was it flowering? And there's pitchery, you know, the native tobacco, and it was everywhere. And that proves that there were pitchery forests in the desert. The indigenous people traded pitchery for ochre to make their paintings. And you know, the archaeologists will say, well, that's funny because I actually found some stone tools here, so near the pitchery forest. So everybody, the dialogue between everybody's specific ways of seeing creates the full picture. And it's really important. That's why I believe it's really important to have a complete understanding. The indigenous people, so necessary, the scientists, so necessary in all the different fields of study, but also artists, and not just male artists, female artists, and artists of all different kind of, you know, it was interesting being the objective observer in India, because I didn't know much about the tribal people, except living with them, about their different, you know, cultures, and they're so distinctive and so different, and there's so many of them, and that's, you know, it's such a rich historical kind of nomadic trade route where I was working, and I couldn't possibly pretend to be informed or knowledgeable about the, you know, the Raika or the Jats or the Rabari or, you know, all the different groups. But that wasn't why I was asked to do it. I was asked to do it as an Australian woman, desert painter, to see through my own lens. So it's the value of the individual distinctions, you know, that makes the whole picture that we need, really.
Yeah, and ultimately any artist, that's all they can really communicate from is their own and their own, like you said, biases and their own viewpoint, you know, which I think one thing that's wonderful with your work, I really appreciate is, you know, how there are many points of access for people. One thing that visual art could do that a writer or a videographer or filmmaker might have a little more of a challenge with is to move beyond language, verbal language, written language, and connect with that emotional center in all of us. And your paintings do that so powerfully. And they, you know, the use of color and form and sort of this balance you strike between figurative and sort of rendered recognizable landscape, and then more like a dreamscape abstraction. I mean, part of it makes me want to travel to these places. And we were looking a little earlier at a video, and if people want to watch it, a video of Abiquiu, New Mexico, they'll get a sense of where you are. But I thought maybe I could pull up some of your work that you shared with me too, and we could talk about it, because really diving into your work is just such a it's such a treat, and I'm excited to have this here in person. Here, I'll start with dry wash, and these are works you said are
yeah. So these are new paintings.
so thank you for allowing us to see these. I know you haven't had them totally professionally photographed, but just to get a chance to look at the work is wonderful. So this is from New Mexico, yeah?
Yeah, so this is the current series, the current body of work that I'm working on. So at the moment I'm working concurrently. So I'm working towards my work with you, my exhibit with you, and around that whole, yeah, I really want to come up and see the museum, like I said to you, and visit with you personally and everything. But so I'm working on the idea of desertification, the idea of deserts of the world, and particularly New Mexico and the deserts of the American Southwest. So that that kind of country, I think you call it four corner country: Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, which I've traveled really extensively, all those four regions. And I'm starting to learn to understand the history and, you know, all of the things that I need to research and understand, but also just having my, like we've been talking about, my own personal experience of this place and the rich cultural and human history and archaeological history. So these are the works that I'm working on concurrently for you and for the GOCA exhibition, but also I've got a big exhibition in Australia next year. So it was going to be towards the beginning of the year, but now it looks like it's going to be about May next year, a big solo exhibition. So some of the works will go, they'll sort of, yeah, I'm working concurrently on 2 shows at the moment. And I'm also working on a book, which is something that I'm really excited to share with you and talk to you about.
Wonderful.
Yeah. So I've done a book. I've done a few books in the past, but yeah, this is going to be another. The American Southwest, the deserts here.
Yeah.
Be about that. Yeah. So.
I think it's a great way to, if you can't experience an exhibit in person, my next favorite way is experiencing art in books. Actually, it's and more artists are, and I know you, like you said, you've gotten already, you know, have that history, but it's such a wonderful way. Thinking about right now where we're doing so much online.
Yeah.
We're trying to figure out how, you know, how to connect to each other and through art online, and it's tricky. And one thing I think that's going to really rise up in this is the analog, you know, really wanting to touch the book and see the work in person when we can. And so this is Fallen Forest. Can you see it?
Yeah. So one thing that I believe really strongly that is important for artists to consider or to acknowledge in their work is that, you know, it's like we were talking about, it's the fresh eyes on things, but artists need to, like you mentioned, break barriers. We need to corrupt and defy expectations. And part of something I feel very strongly about in my work is the prejudices that people have about deserts, the prejudices people have about desert communities, rural people, desert people, nomadic people. And I come up against this all the time. I do a lot of lectures and a lot of public program talks and things, and you know, books and all that we were talking about, and people always come to me, and it shocks me that they can have listened to something and they have witnessed an exhibition and, you know, maybe feel informed, but then they come and the first thing they say to you is something that is unbelievably prejudicial about what they expect a desert is. So, and coming here to the American Southwest, I was guilty of that myself. So I thought, oh, another desert, you know. But this is high mountain desert, which is so different to what I've experienced. And in Australia, the inland of our continent is actually, the further towards the center of the continent of Australia that you get, the lower you get. So the center of our continent is well below sea level. So I've stood on our biggest salt lake, one of the biggest salt lakes in the world. I think it's the second biggest in the world, Lake Eyre. And I've stood in Lake Eyre dry on the salt bed. And I think I'm 10, 15 meters below sea level at that point. So our rivers run inland rather than out to the sea. So there's all the, and that was my understanding of deserts. And then when I was, I've traveled through Africa and India and, like I said, Asia, deserts of Asia. And you just start to realize the different topography and how deserts can be defined scientifically in so many different ways. Obviously people know about the Arctic and the Antarctic as being deserts. But coming here, I actually was so shocked at the difference in this desert, because it being high mountain desert, it is so rich. I mean, this is America. It's rich in plants and animals and water. There's not just the big rivers, the Rio Grande River and the Chama River and all the tributaries and everything that run, like we were saying, through the Rocky Mountains and down out to the Gulf of Mexico. But there's all these other rivers, and there's subterranean water, and people live on well water, and people farm on well water, and people they've established cities here and whole communities here, and it sustains life, and it's very habitable, which is not the case in Australia. And India, lots of parts of India, the deserts, they're just totally uninhabitable, and that's why people are nomadic. So here they can be established pueblos, and the people, the Anasazi people did start to establish pueblos, and the Native American indigenous people stayed in these pueblos and villages. And even though they were nomadic, there was this sense of not having to move so seasonally and be so nomadic. They started farming, and farming is very practical here in the desert.
Oh yeah, and I should articulate that the nomadic tribes that I'm referencing, Ute and Cheyenne and Arapaho, were more north of New Mexico. You're absolutely right. The settlement and the farming down there, and the history of that, and cultivating of animals, has a longer history in New Mexico, I think, than a little bit north. We're kind of really like almost the Great Plains. We're the western edge of the Great Plains right here, where the Rockies meet them. And it's amazing how different it can be. But that's a great distinction. And it's also fascinating just hearing, that perspective, because we do tend to think of it as so dry, depending on where you're from and your frame of reference. And you're saying compared to these other deserts, it's lush and
it's still dry. I mean, there's all the white sands and it's still arid. I mean, it's still desert. I think we've had one day of maybe 4 drops of rain in the last 8 months. But it's very rich in wildlife, and even the Great Plains, in Colorado and up in Utah and Arizona, the bison and the buffalo, and there's antelope and deer. It's very rich in resources, is what I'm saying. And actually, that's one of the prejudices that I was talking about. And I see, this is why I'm no good at articulating. I sort of lose my streams and stuff.
You're great. Just having a conversation.
No, but it's the resourceness. Often deserts are viewed by people as a resource for farming or uranium or water, or I know in Uzbekistan, like the Russian government used all the big natural desert lakes to cotton farm in Uzbekistan, and so they've desalinated, like they've created this unbelievable salinity problem now because all those lakes have been drained. But so it's human nature to see desert as a resource, and this area, this Four Corner country, is a very, very diverse and rich resource. But the thing that interests me about deserts, and artistically the thing that the barriers I want to break down and the prejudices I want to subvert, are the fact that it's a spiritual resource. The desert is a cultural resource. It feeds something instinctively fundamental in us as humans. That's why we continue to migrate here and refine these roots, these nomadic roots. It's a type of homecoming, because it has the desert has this very I've lost you. The desert has this fundamental nature that allows you to reconnect to something that's intrinsically human, which is that, I don't know what people describe it in different ways, whether it's the force, the source, God, Mother Nature, how it's a fundamental force that we are instinctively as animals drawn to, and the desert is very rich in it. All deserts are, and they house it as a kind of a sanctuary. And when you look into desert history and the human history of deserts, you find, in the petroglyphs that we were talking about, in the archaeology, and in the Spanish colonial, or the colonial settlements, you find this. People are drawn always, the indigenous people are drawn to deserts because they recognize it as being the source of something that is intrinsically human. And
that's so interesting. I've spent a good amount of time in New Mexico. I have family there, and the nuclear legacy of Mexico, when you think about it in those terms, and the way that land, and I'm sorry, I'm just sort of toggling through your wonderful images you've shared with me as we talk. So talking, your perspective of the desert in that sense, and then this sort of tragedy of treating it as this wasteland, like, oh, it's just empty space that we can pollute with,
out there because there's no one's living out there. It's like, oh, hang on a minute.
Yeah, and when you talk about it in this way as this spiritual sort of center for cultures, it's extremely, like, it's so disrespectful. I mean, it already really is. The nuclear legacy of the West is just so, really, it launched us into the nuclear era, right? The test at Trinity. And where we're at now, in many ways, we couldn't go back from that moment. But then to just sort of treat these sites, the test sites in Nevada, for instance, which is another desert area, as just sort of a burial for waste. And it just really brought up for me, while you were talking, this hard truth that we just have really disrespected our spiritual core in many ways, if we think of the land as that, and the people that were here, and the animals, just that's what I think. With your work, I'm really struck by how the way you you obviously have a very deep knowledge of the land and archaeology, and you've spent years, decades, like you said, studying and researching in the field, and then obviously your practices as an artist, but you have all this experience. But then the experience of your work, when we look at it, is so emotional, and it shows such a respect to the place, that I can't help but come through. And I feel like that can be a really powerful ecological statement.
Well, I don't want it to
not overly, obviously, hitting anyone over the head, and that can be a more powerful way to talk about the importance of land than any other way, in my opinion.
And thank you for saying that. I don't want them to be just merely colorful, beautiful paintings that people say, oh wow, I can see the sun, or I can see the forest, or any of that. It's about looking, like we were saying. So the more you look, the more you think, is that a haze? Is that bushfire? Is that a Holocaust? What is that light? And like the fallen forest, these paintings all have a duality to them. So one of the hard things for a painter in the 21st century is people are so plagued by images, and their concentration span for looking at images is scrolling, flicking. And so even going to museums and going to galleries and trying to arrest people, trying to stop people so that they look long enough to give artworks like you said, the respect and the time that they deserve, so that you can see that there's depth, you know, there's some kind of substance beneath the surface, that and there's an inherent, not a message, because my work isn't political, or, you know, I don't consider myself a socially didactic artist or anything like that, but it's also not purely aesthetic. So that all that knowledge and all that understanding, and like you say, all the emotional content, the evocation, and the sense of it being surreal, dreamlike, whatever you like. But then you start to see that things aren't as your prejudice might expect them to be. Trees may be upside down, or the light might be make you feel nervous or make you feel uncomfortable, and you don't understand why that is. Or formations might be not too regular, or things might seem chaotic or abstract, and you don't understand if something is, like you said, representational or being abstracted, and the reason for that and what that is, and whether that's a man-made manipulation, whether that's human interference, whether that, like, what are we doing? You know, the thing is about deserts, like I was saying, aside from their aesthetic, their beauty and their importance, you know, to the human spirit and our emotional connection to Mother Nature, to the planet. It's where our culture comes from. Deserts house our culture. They're the starting point. Mount Athos in Greek was the starting point for Christianity. So for spiritual religions and for the human soul, deserts always housed the source of that, the starting point of that. But also, deserts are so fragile ecologically and so interconnected. They're migratory routes for birds. You know, these rivers that people think that they can just plug up and turn, you know, build new dams and turn lakes saline, and these are houses for all these resources that we depend on, you know, animals and plants and ecological communities. And they're very, very desert ecologies are very fragile, extremely vulnerable, and these populations, human populations and tribal people, they're the most endangered on the planet. In Africa, in India, all across the planet, nomadic people now are the most endangered people, nomadic tribal people on the planet. More than refugees, they get no attention because they have no homelands, they're tribal. So no governments will allow them to cross borders anymore. They have nowhere to go. Rural communities and villages are so poor, they don't want nomadic people because they're dwindling their resources with their animals, with their goats and buffaloes. So rural communities very actively persecute tribal people all over the world, and they chase them out of their rural community and they go home. But where do they go? They don't have homeland.
Yeah.
So, like in India, for example, and in Pakistan and Afghanistan, those tribal communities that came down through China and they came across from Persia, and you'll see it in the people, their eyes are blue, their skin is very black, and their eyes are blue often, or green. And the people, the settled rural communities of Pakistan, India and China, they don't like them because they don't recognize them as of their community and their type of people. But nobody in the world recognizes them because they don't have traditional homeland.
That's really fascinating. Yeah.
And agricultural companies fence them out, so they have nowhere to graze their animals, so they're dying all over the world. They're the most highly endangered people on the planet. Sorry, that's I'm very emotional about it because
and you've spent time and connected, and you know, it made me think, unless you have land, like unless you own land in our current structure, you really don't have power, you know. And so if you are, because there's one area in the Sangre in the near the Sangre de Cristos, a high mountain valley in Colorado that has one of the last sort of communal land areas, and there's been a big fight with a ranch wanting to take it over, and it was for communal grazing, you know, in the San Luis Valley, and that's just a small area, and that model doesn't fit with the, you know, this capitalist, you know, fenced off agricultural, you know, this is my land, that's your land, demarcations.
And that's what this whole river valley was. This
Yeah.
was land grant. So
Yeah.
this is where the, not just the indigenous and pre-indigenous Anasazi people used to farm and you know, raise crops in little stone beds. It was incredible what they did, and also graze their animals. And then, you know, the Spanish granted land here, and it was, all this was communal grazing, and there's still a lot of communal grazing here. But Ghost Ranch, for example, that, I mean, there's a lot of stolen land from very clever lawyers and colonialists, and it's at, you know, people love it because they come here and they say, oh, it's Ghost Ranch, you know, it's famous and all this, and you think, well, it's famous before the artists sort of gave it an aesthetic value. It was famous as really important grazing land for the communities and the people around here. But it's the same, you know, all over the world. Big multicultural farming companies all over the world, in Australia, in Asia, everywhere, are taking over. Like you said, governments are granting them licenses to fence off and take over and farm communal grazing land that used to be allowed for the communities to graze their cattle or graze their sheep or graze. And, you know, the buffalo, the sheep, people think they're feral animals. They're not actually feral animals. You know, the buffalo and the Karai camel in India, and the bunny buffalo, and the goats, like the Churro sheep here, you know, that they're a particular breed, a species that is so diminished now. I think there's 2,000 Karai camels left in the wild, and they're the only camels that swim in the world. And they've just discovered there's an enzyme in the milk that suppresses fitting for people who have epilepsy and things like that. Like we haven't even researched the desert and the plants and animals before we're destroying everything. So yeah.
Well, you know, people use the word primitive. I think we're the ones, you know, our culture is extremely primitive in how we overlook, you know, there's just sort of like the clumsy, like land grab and dig, you know, all the resources out of the earth that you can and get all the cash you can as fast as you can. And meanwhile, you've got this depth of resources, like the area you're talking about. What made it special is all that history and those people. And then you just, if you wipe it away from abusive land practices, then you don't have that anymore. And it doesn't just, you know, it doesn't retain that.
And deserts can't regenerate like the rest of it's very slow to regenerate them, and they often can't. And you destroy a habitat or an ecology, it won't come back. If you destroy a mound spring, a natural spring from an artesian basin of water, which has managed to find its way up through all the geology to the surface of the earth and create this microhabitat where there are fish in the desert, you know, the minute that's so fragile, the minute that's disturbed, gone. And you don't know what species you've made extinct from just disturbing that. You know, that's why it's so important to treat it with so much respect, because we don't know what we're losing. But we do know we're losing diversity. We do know that we're making everything. So, I mean, it's as if there was one art form in the world, or one musician, or one writer. I mean, who wants that? You want diversity.
Yeah, that's a really great way to put it, right? Like put it in terms of what we crave that. We want, you know, we look for that, but in the natural world, we're completely obliterating that.
Yeah.
Talking with you makes me want to go read about 20 books and listen to many podcasts and realize there's this whole part of the world that I, you know, want to dive deeper in. So I'm grateful for that. And I think your work has real power, very powerful way exciting, that desire to learn more, because you naturally have that, you know, just from your, just talking with you is such a delight. I want to go ahead and we could probably talk for 3 hours. I think we're at about an hour and 20 minutes. And, but I want to be respectful of your time too, and say that we'll share more links and resources with when we share this studio visit out. But just getting a chance to talk with you and dive into the work, I'm very grateful. Thanks, Joe, so much.
Oh, look, I wish you could be here, Daisy. You know, I want to pull open drawers and show you things. And yeah, I wish I could even move my computer around, but we're going to do it. We will. Chance to actually be back in the.
And in a way, we did that. We pulled open some drawers. They were computer files, but there's still some drawers. And we opened up those doors to thinking about the world in different ways, which is what I really love about your work. I appreciate that so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to working with you. I think it's going to be a very symbiotic relationship of like minds. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.